small till it ain't, till it ain't, till it ain't, till it ain't. I'm building up a wall till it breaks. She hated when I call and it's late. I don't wanna keep you waiting. I hope I never keep you waiting. She think I know it all, but I don't.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Mixtape with Scott. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics at Baylor University. And this week we have a person you probably have heard of by their last name, or you know them personally, Timothy Bartik of the Bartik Instruments. I was super excited to have him on the show. Timothy Bartik is a senior economist at the Upjohn Institute. He's a labor economist. He focuses a lot on local, regional labor market policies that affect development and labor supply. Did his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison back in the early 80s, and has had just a very interesting career that has actually been very impactful. He's not in academia, and he's going to talk a little bit about that, about the journey that he went on and the kinds of questions he's really interested in. What's always been his passion, as his passions and his personalities like. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I did doing it. And this is just for those that are new to the podcast. What is this podcast about? I remember seeing a comment on YouTube once, and they were like, "Where's all the economics in this?" And there's no shortage of podcasts and interviews with economists where they talk about what's going to be the effect of the election on GDP, and when is the Fed going to raise monetary policy? There's no shortage of that. There is a shortage of economists having an opportunity to talk about their story and about their journey, and that's what I'm really interested in. It's not that I'm not interested in economics, and we do typically at the very end have conversations about research, but it's usually their stuff. It's not just like, tell me about the world. It's about their creative scientific output. And that's what I want. I want people to hear the stories of living economists. I think those stories don't get told enough. And frankly, I also do it for selfish reasons. I really love to hear people's personal stories, and it's so, to me, it's really helpful. When I hear where a person came from, it just gives me the ability, for some reason, to understand what they do. But for some reason, I just also kind of get a sense of my own place in the universe too, a little bit. And the other reason for the podcast to do it this way is I'm also trying to tell, or rather trying to let people tell the personal stories, and then through that have an oral history of the profession that just kind of naturally ends up getting told. I want it to just be its own natural quilt, just sort of one of those fabric-based quilts with these little swatches where everybody's little story kind of fits on this quilt. Before you know it, we've just been over 4 seasons, like sewing them together. And at some point, maybe when we hit 1,000 interviews, we're at like 110 or 115 or something right now. When we hit it, we can just hold it up and we can stick it on the wall and go, that weird quilt is sort of some non-random, highly selected version of the profession. And that's what I'm wanting to do. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you so much for your support. I highly encourage you to share this with people. Timothy's a wonderful guest, and I hope you enjoy this a lot. Peace out. It is my pleasure today to have with me someone who I've known about and written about in my book, Dr. Tim Bartik. Tim, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
For the sake of the listener, could you tell us, you've already said your name, or I already said your name, but tell us your full title and who pays your paycheck.
Well, I'm a senior economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, which is a nonprofit and nonpartisan research organization in Kalamazoo. It's kind of a unique place. It's has a large endowment and kind of functions like a research university, but obviously no students. So,
Ah, got it, got it, got it, got it. How many people are at Upjohn?
well, that's hard to say. Depends how you want to count them. There are about, I think, 11 senior researchers who are almost all well, mostly economists. There's a sociologist and political scientist. And then we have a whole crew of research assistants, many of whom were at the Institute for 30 or 40 years. And
Mm.
we have a library, we have a communications staff. And then the Institute actually is unusual. We also have run since the early 1970s the government funded job training programs in the area, in the Kalamazoo area.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
Michigan Works Southwest so that's like a completely separate thing, but there's some interaction between the operations division and the research division. Obviously, when we talk about job training issues, and occasionally we certainly have the opportunity to talk to them about the programs they're running and some of the practical issues they run into, and that sometimes informs our research. And occasionally we're able to do some little experiments with some certain aspects of their operations.
Oh, cool. Well, I got Upjohn at the end, so I'll wait at the end. But that's I'm looking forward to learning more about it. All right. Well, let's start with an icebreaker. I like to start with an icebreaker. So, what's a vacation that you have been on? Maybe it's not your favorite vacation. Maybe it's not the worst vacation, although it could be either. But it's a vacation that you have noticed every now and then pops in your mind.
Well, one thing that pops in my mind, and actually pops in my mind particularly because of this current political moment, is when I was a kid, we didn't go on really fancy vacations. We'd either go out to Missouri, to rural Missouri, where my mother's was from, and on the farm area, or we'd go to Cape May, New Jersey. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I remember being in Cape May, New Jersey, in August of 1968. I think
Mm.
August. I'm not really sure. But was that whenever the Democratic National Convention was?
Oh, that's what you
And the
did.
only
That-
TV station so we'd go to the beach and we'd play skee ball and miniature golf and go in the ocean, go body surfing and whatnot. And then at night we'd be watching this Democratic convention and watching the Democratic Party melt down with demonstrations in the streets. And
Oh.
we'd be watching this, and the only station we get was CBS. This is before cable, obviously. You can only get one station in Cape May.
Yeah, if you were
And
lucky.
they would go off the air at 12 midnight sharp and play the Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah.
And so we're in the middle of all this. Walter Cronkite is talking about how there's riots in the streets and this is going on. And all of a sudden, bam, no Walter Cronkite, Star Spangled Banner. So I think of that in particular, given that we're having the Democratic Convention in Chicago this year again. So
Yeah, yeah.
So I remember that because I came from a family. I was very interested in politics when I was a kid. I still
Mm.
am, obviously, but I was a political junkie. Very early on, 7, 8, 9 years old, I was interested in
Wow.
politics. So.
Huh. Okay, I'm gonna do one question and get to that question. So where did you grow up? You may have said it, but
I grew up in the Philadelphia area. I grew up before my parents were divorced. I mostly grew up in Jenkintown, which is a relatively small town just north of Philadelphia.
ah,
And then after my parents got divorced, we moved to Elkins Park, which is just north of Philadelphia. And
mm,
then I went to public school through seventh grade, and then starting in eighth grade, I went to one of the Quaker schools in Philadelphia, Germantown Friends School, which is in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, which
oh,
was quite a contrast from the suburbs. I don't know if you know Philadelphia at all, but Germantown is a quite high poverty neighborhood in
oh.
the northwest of the city. So that was an interesting contrast between this private school and then the surrounding neighborhood.
Those Quaker schools, they're usually like very selective, academically rigorous schools, right?
Well, they're academically rigorous. I don't know how selective they are, particularly. They're somewhat selective. I mean, I don't. I mean, it was. I don't remember any entrance test or anything like that that I
Uh-huh.
had to take to get in. And it's a small school. My graduating class was 73. It
Huh.
actually was more of an income and racial mix than Jenkintown was. Jenkintown had some uh, racial integration and class integration. I mean, but not that much. Germantown Friends had been a Quaker school that opted to stay in the city and not move to
Mm,
suburbs, even though a bunch of their alumni wanted them to. They had stayed
mm,
in Germantown even as Germantown became a much more high poverty area. And one of the things they did is they had a community scholars program, which
mm,
admitted kids from the neighborhood. So uh, my class of 70 had like 10, 15 kids from the surrounding neighborhood who I don't know if they were 100% African American, but so there was a lot of interesting. I mean, this is, of course, in the 60s. I mean, I started Germantown Friends, I think, in 67, 68.
mm,
The civil rights movement's going on. There are riots in different cities. Martin Luther King. There's the March on the Pentagon. It was a very politically active. So I grew up in a very politically active time.
mm,
Germantown Friends, quite liberal school. You know, uh, my math teacher went to the March on the Pentagon and got hit by a police officer with a baton. I don't know.
mm.
And the Quakers, of course, are, believe in a peace witness. I remember
Yeah.
we heard at one school assembly, they had a person come in to talk who was a conscious objector, but had decided to give up his conscious objector status and take sanctuary in the meeting house and wait to be arrested because he
Oh.
felt it was wrong for him to use his Quaker background as a way of not he felt he needed to put his body and life on the line. So it was a very and that was welcome to me because I was very, as I said, we always discussed politics at home. We discussed the candidates. We discussed the who was running for president, who was running for governor, who was running for mayor in Philadelphia. And it was a very politically active time with a lot of different, well, I mean, everyone knows the 60s were, people talk about today being a tumultuous time, but, in my view, the late
It was
60s and early
much more so.
70s I mean, you think about 68, there were some books about this, with Martin Luther King being assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy, all this stuff going on in Chicago, and then of course Vietnam going on constantly, and
Right.
people were always
Right.
talking about this stuff. You had
Yeah.
to, unless you were dead to the world, you had to talk about this stuff.
Right. 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 Well, your parents, was it because of the causal effect of the environment or the day that they were very political, or was it just this is your family?
I think it's my family, particularly my mother. My mother grew up in a kind of a farm Democrat household in Missouri. Her dad was been very active in rural electrification. He was
Mm.
noted for saying he always voted for the best candidate for the office, but the best candidate was always a Democrat.
Yeah.
So he was pretty partisan and was a big
Uh-huh.
advocate of rural improvement, big fan of FDR.
Mm.
And my mom was very political, and my dad maybe less so, but we certainly we had meetings of United World Federalists at our house, and my mother was a committee woman for the Democratic Party, and my mom, before, I don't remember this, but she ran for the school board once before my memory, and anyway, yeah, so they were very political.
So you just grew up in that environment. And so from a little kid, when you say that you were very political, what does that mean when like a 9-year-old is very political?
Oh, I like talking about debating, what to do about Vietnam, or I like debating. I remember watching on TV when the filibuster was broken in the Civil Rights Act of 64.
Mm.
When they invoked cloture, they got 67 votes so they could pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And I remember actually watching Richardson Dilworth was the head of the Philadelphia School Board. I used to watch meetings on TV. I had my first cousin was was older than me went to GW University, and she and her boyfriend used to come visit us, and we would just talk politics all weekend. He was a political science major. This is in the late 60s. We discussed Vietnam. We discussed what to do about the nation's cities. And I just can't. I mean, obviously, people grow up in different environments. I mean, some people are just apolitical. I don't really understand being apolitical. To me, I just have always been interested in it, and read a lot of history books and whatnot, and that kind of thing.
You had like a very strong sense of civic responsibility, a real love of the, is it, you had a real love of the like American political system, or is it, or a real concern about, inequality and poverty and regional poverty? And
well,
I
certainly was very concerned about, it wasn't simply like politics as a game. I mean, we would talk about poverty, and then, the contrast when you go to this Quaker school, which is on some nice grounds in the middle of this inner city neighborhood, and, and then you have some students who are from the neighborhood, and they obviously have a different perspective.
Yeah.
You're discussing race relations. I mean, the students petitioned to have a black student center, and that was controversial, and they ended up establishing it, and there was a lot of discussions about, the current discussions were going on back then. I mean, how to deal with racial inequalities and how to deal with economic inequalities. So, I definitely, there's a reason for being interested in politics, which is that it affects the world around you. And if you think you're a member of society and you want to make things for the better, then I think you have to be concerned with politics.
Right. So you're in high school, and when you're thinking about, I mean, that a lot of what you're describing seems like a person who's got a long horizon already sort of in mind. Like you're probably thinking about what you want to be when you grow up. I just like thinking to myself that I would think a person like that is thinking about their future very early on.
Well, I was, although it definitely wasn't economics at the time. I always thought at the time when I was going off to college, I was very interested in politics. I read a lot of science fiction as a kid, but I also read, my favorite writer was Hannah Arendt. I used to read a lot of Hannah Arendt. I think I read most of her stuff when I was in high school.
Oh, wow.
Eichmann in Jerusalem, Origins of Totalitarianism, On Revolution, The Human Condition, all those stuff. And I thought I wanted to be a lawyer for the ACLU, is what I thought I wanted to be. I'd be a civil liberties lawyer going around arguing civil rights cases and whatnot. And so that was my orientation in high school and going up to college, that I would probably go to college. I'd probably do a lot of, major in philosophy or political science or something like that, and end up becoming a civil rights lawyer. Economics was not in my radar screen at all.
It was coming up a little bit, or not really? Because you're thinking about foreign conflict, but you're also thinking about poverty, but it's always in the context of this.
Well, my attitude at the time was I wanted to think about these big issues of how society should be structured, and political fundamental issues of how society should be structured. That Hannah Arendt deals with that. How do you what went wrong that led to Nazism and fascism and Stalinism, and led to democracy having all these problems, and how do you solve these problems? And I guess I don't think it's not like I analyzed this and said, I'm not going to major in economics because of this, that, and the other thing. But I think my attitude at the time was, and this reflects, I think, a lot of ignorance on my part, frankly. I tended to think of economics was just let the free market rip.
Right.
My impression of economics was, okay, it's free market all the time. There's no government because you don't want any government interferes with the market. And I of course, knew nothing about public economics and market
Why do you think that
failures.
was? Is that like that was at that time? There was that level of discourse. What year are we talking about right now? Early 70s?
Well, I graduated from high school in 1972 and headed off to college. And, it's still a politically active time. And I don't know I don't, for whatever reason, I had never been exposed to the right kind of economics to make me see things differently. I think,
When is Goldwater's campaign?
64.
So there probably was like some of that, right? And then there's this Cold War kind of rhetoric. And I mean, I don't know exactly when popular libertarian books came out, but like, is Capitalism and Freedom around and
Well, yeah, Milton
and all that
Friedman was
stuff?
around. I mean, I remember reading back when Newsweek, there'd be
Yeah,
columns
Newsweek,
by Paul
right.
Samuelson would have a column,
Yeah,
and Milton Friedman had a column, and you'd
right.
read that. And the general impression I had was that economics was pro an
Pro
unregulated
free
free
market. Yeah,
market.
yeah, yeah.
And
Right.
and I think there's some of that in economics. Economics does argue for the power of the market and that there are reasons why markets exist. But I don't think I'd ever heard the term market failure or
Yeah,
externalities
yeah,
or public
sure.
goods. These were not, because you don't. I don't know. Maybe if I'd had some teacher in high school who had taught economics and I would have had a different perspective
Right.
but for whatever reason it just wasn't on my radar screen.
Yeah,
So
sure. So you go to Yale. You get the other, first of all, that must have been I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that pretty exciting
oh yeah,
getting
well
into
Yale
an
was very
Ivy League
exciting.
school and going
Sure.
there?
Well, sure, because it's being a Germantown Friends School was certainly an intellectually challenging environment, but Yale was more intellectually challenging. I mean, there was some
Mm,
really fascinating people. I ended up majoring in what I thought I might major. I majored in political philosophy. I took tons of courses reading about Plato and Machiavelli and
mm,
Nietzsche and Kant, whatever.
yeah.
And I still read that stuff. I love reading different political philosophy, John
Mm.
Rawls, et cetera, Sen,
Because you're
independent
saying,
economic.
because you said for you, politics wasn't really you weren't interested in the game part of it as much, right? You were
No,
like,
I'm interested in trying to see what is justice. How do we get a
what
more
is
just
justice?
society? How do
Right.
we what personal attitudes should we have to promote that? What political how do we create a better community than we currently have? So
Yeah.
I was taking a bunch of these courses. I created my own major at Yale. It's not a political philosophy is not a standard major. I basically
I've never even
took
heard of it. Yeah.
no, well, I created it. You could propose your own major, and I basically said, okay, I'll take all the political philosophy courses in the political science department, and I'll take
Oh,
all the political philosophy courses in the philosophy department, and that was
oh.
my major. And 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 I had to write a senior thesis and all that kind of stuff. But uh, uh,
Your
and
teachers in high school, if your teachers in high school at that Quaker school, they had said, yeah, Tim Bartik's going to go to Yale and he's going to invent his own major and it's going to be political philosophy. Would they all go, yeah, of course he would. That's
Well, yeah,
exactly.
because basically in high school, my two best subjects were history and math, and
Oh,
I really was into history. I had a very good history teacher at Germantown Friends, Pat Reisneider. I also had some
oh,
great teachers at Yale. I mean, my advisor was a guy named Tom Pangle, who is a quite well-known guy. Later on, got denied tenure at Yale in a very controversial case. I think he now
oh.
teaches at University of Texas. But anyway, he was a great teacher, and in fact, all along the way, I think in terms of my academic career, I've had some wonderful teachers who have encouraged me to debate topics. Because I remember even in high school in history, we studied ancient Greek history, and we would kind of study, well, why did things happen this way? We would ask a lot of questions analyzing why the society developed in a certain way, which in some
Hmm.
sense is a preparation for economics. I mean, I think why is society working this way?
Right,
But
right. So no econ at Yale.
I took one econ course. I graduated in 3 years. My mom, after the
Wow.
divorce, didn't have as much money.
Yeah.
And so she didn't say I had to do it, but I had a bunch of advanced placement credits. And so I could graduate in 3 years if I took, I had to take 12 courses my senior year.
Mm.
But I did that and I graduated in 3 years. And the last semester at Yale, I was just looking to fill a slot. I took a 1 semester intro to econ for non-majors, micro and macro.
Yeah.
And actually, I enjoyed that. I learned some things, and I think I started to change my impression of economics a little bit based on that. That
Yeah,
I
the
realized
micro
that,
macro is going to get you a bigger sweep of stuff. The micro macro, it's like, growth and unemployment and
oh
like,
yeah, we were debating. It,
yeah,
it you know it presented the basics of. I don't remember the precise content of the course at this stage, but it was a basic intro to these things, and I was just filling up a schedule because I was trying to graduate in 3 years to
yeah.
save my mom some money, and
Mhm.
but in any event, I didn't. I still thought my senior year that I'm going to become a civil liberties lawyer.
Mm,
Um, but then when it came down to it, I thought to myself, do I really want to go to law school right now? Do I really know what I want to do? And
yeah.
I decided I didn't, that I wasn't sure that this was the right course. And of course, going to law school is quite a commitment of time and money.
Mhm.
I did take the LSATs, I remember, in the fall, but I didn't apply anywhere. And I
Mhm.
actually decided that, and this actually led me in what led me in economics is indirectly, as I'll explain it down the road. I ended up deciding, look, I'm interested in public policy and politics. I'll go get a job on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant in
Mhm.
DC. So the summer after I graduated, which was be the summer of 1975, I decided I started writing different congressmen,
Mm.
trying to get a legislative assistant job. I think I must have written, I picked out all the congressmen who I thought I could work for, which were mostly Democrats, but there were some, relatively there were liberal Republicans then,
Mhm.
and wrote them and tried to get something, and nothing developed. And eventually, my mom agreed to use her relatively scarce resources and say, "Look, I can give you enough money, for like a couple months' rent." And I went down to DC without a job and found some roommates, lived in a house in Arlington, and then I started wandering around Capitol Hill with my resume,
Mhm.
uh, trying to get a job. And
Mm. Oh, you're like
uh,
20?
I would have been, let's see, 75. I would have been 21. I just turned
Oh.
21. And
This is the fall of what?
fall of
75.
1975. And
Okay.
eventually, I eventually I stumbled into the office of Congressman Don Regal, who was a congressman from Flint, Michigan, who was
Mm.
running for the U.S. Senate. I don't know if he announced yet in the fall of 1976. And they said, well, we can't hire you, but you can volunteer here. We want you to write issue briefs on different issues.
Mm.
The idea was, I think, they were doing this project where they were going to have issue
Who's this
briefs.
guy again? This is the guy you
Don
refer.
Regal,
This is
congressman
Don
from
Regal.
Flint.
Yeah.
He was elected senator in 1976. So, of course, we didn't
Right.
know that then, but he was running for the Senate. And they said, you
Ah,
can volunteer here and write issue briefs for the campaign. And actually,
ah,
that skill has served me well to this day, because what I had to do is they would tell me, well, we want an issue brief. It can be no longer than 1 page,
huh.
describing the key issues in the Middle East, or the key
Mm.
issues on oil prices, or the key issue on the Clean Air Act and how
Yeah.
it affects Michigan, or the key issues on uh, whatever redlining. And so you had to basically do instant research and come up with a one page issue brief in like 24 hours or 48 hours.
Jeez.
So I did that on a volunteer basis while working as a waiter at a restaurant at
What are you just
50.
living at the library? How do you get on? You don't have the internet. What are you doing?
Oh, well, the basic thing was I would, on a lot of issues, you can look in Congressional Quarterly and National
Oh
Journal.
yeah, because you're in DC, right?
I'm
Yeah,
in
yeah.
DC, and then of course I could ask Congressional Research Service. So I sometimes would call up Congressional Research Service, and they have all these
Yeah.
analysts, they're experts, and they're
Ah,
used to this. I mean, your
um,
government in DC is still in the Congress being run by people in their 20s. So all these people in their 20s. So I'd call up the people at CRS and say, well, I need you to give me the 5 key things I need to read to understand this issue.
Yeah.
And can you give it to me by noon today?
Because
I'm
they're
calling
like
it.
fielding all these people having to write these one
Yeah,
page.
so I'm having to go. So I go over there. So I call them up at 9:30 and say, I need all this information by 11 a.m. If you can give me the 5 key things to read. So I'd read
Yeah.
the 5 key things they said, articles I should read. And
Yeah.
then I'd read, find out what was going on with legislation in National Journal or Congressional Quarterly. And
Yeah.
then I'd write up the issue brief. And
Oh,
and
it's
then
like
I'd have to,
legit. This is like legit. This is like legit stuff. This isn't like pamphleteering. You're digging deep into the actual source code of real policy information.
right. And so, anyway, I was doing this and then volunteering at his office. And then I was working as a waiter at a restaurant at 15th and K Street Northwest. And eventually I kind of burned out on this. So around the beginning of December, I was just completely burned out because I was working, like
This
4
is
nights
still
a week.
75. This is
Yeah,
still
75.
Oh,
Yeah, so I was
yeah.
working 4 nights a week at this restaurant, 4 or 5 nights a week, and I was working 40 hours a week at Regal's office
Oh
without
my
being
gosh.
paid. So I was working like 80 hours a week or
Yeah.
70 hours a week. I don't know. I was ridiculous. And so by December, I was completely burned out.
Yeah.
And I said to them, look, I really can't keep doing this. Is there any possibility I can get paid? And at that point, they said, okay, you've done a great job. And we're willing to pay you. Your starting salary is $8,000.
Okay.
And I became a legislative assistant. And I
How
was
many of
doing
those
it.
are there? How many legislative assistants are there?
I think at the time you had like 4 or 5 legislative assistants in his congressional office. Then you had like 2 what are people called legislative correspondents who handle the mail. And then you had like an administrative assistant, and then there was kind of there was his chief of staff, and then there was a political guy who handled the politics and was helping manage his campaign. And so then I started working on different aspects, including I was legislative assistant. And one of the key things that happened then that, indirectly led me to where I am now is I was asked to write an issue brief that was later on used in the campaign. This was not like a 1-page thing, but was like a 10 or 15-page thing on what to do about the plight of our nation's cities. And it was obviously a lot centered on Detroit because he was running for statewide office in Michigan. He was from Flint. And so I had to talk to a lot of people in Detroit city government and in different organizations and try to come up with a policy thing. And so I wrote a thing all about how to create jobs in a place like Detroit. And I got really interested. I mean, I'd always been interested in urban poverty and cities. I came from Philadelphia. I love cities. I like big cities.
Yeah.
And Detroit was fascinating. I learned a lot about the history of the place. And obviously, Detroit's been through a lot. It's hopefully coming back now. But I wrote this big thing, and it got some public attention. In the campaign, it was released as part of the campaign. It was covered favorably by.
But this is different than these 1-pagers. What is this?
This was like a campaign. End up being released as a campaign document. That was, okay. This is back when I don't know. Maybe people when I guess campaigns still do this, but the press doesn't. It was a document released by the campaign as okay. This is Don Regal's program for what to do about to help our nation's cities.
Oh, that's cool.
And he's running for the Senate, and obviously this is a big issue in Michigan. How do you help Detroit? How do you help Flint?
So Detroit and Flint. This is when you're already starting to see signs of Detroit and Flint struggling. Because I actually only know of it from that documentary, the Michael guy.
Oh, Detroit had already would really. I mean, there were huge racial tensions. Obviously, there had been the riots in the late '60s. There were of course the suburbs, big divisions between the suburbs and the city. I still remember at one point visiting Detroit back, and this would have been back in probably sometime in 1976 or 1977. I don't remember when. And the head of housing community development for the city taking me around the city. And at that point, you could see whole blocks that were still burned out from the riots in 67. So, it definitely was a tough period for the city. It was declining in population. It was losing jobs. There were a lot of racial tensions. And one of the issues, well, how do you turn things around? And also politically, what kind of platform is something that the public might support? And if I don't actually, it'd be interesting. I don't even know where I could find maybe somewhere in my documents I have the old thing I wrote, but this is who knows where it is. But the the program I proposed definitely was centered on jobs and trying to get more people into jobs in the city of Detroit, creating jobs, getting people into jobs, hopefully then getting them to upgrade the jobs into better jobs. And it was really that I think that led me to economics, because I started thinking to myself, I really need to understand this issue of how, one, what policies might create jobs,
right,
and two, what policies might help increase the benefits that jobs provide. I mean, there's still a question: you create jobs, who gets the jobs?
right.
Does it actually benefit? I mean, you create the fact that you plop jobs down in the neighborhood doesn't mean the neighborhood residents get the jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
so you have to think about how to link people up with jobs.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking, I need to know more economics. And
at
so
that
this
time,
is,
you think at that time the economics is becoming not the free market ideology
I
that
don't
you
know if there was
thought it
any
was?
change in the economics profession. There was just a change in that my thinking was I needed to understand this better.
No, I mean, you started to realize, oh, there's more to it. There's like
right. And I started saying I needed to take some courses.
Yeah.
And again, Regal was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1976. I became his leader. He served in the Senate Banking Committee, which includes housing and community development. The community development block grant program goes through that committee. All the federal housing programs go through that committee. The stuff with redlining and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act goes through that committee. And so I was just legislative assistant for all this housing, urban development stuff. So I said, I have to understand this better. What is the economics of a city? What makes a city tick? How does a city economy work? And so,
had you read any Jane Jacobs?
I'm trying to remember when I read Jane Jacobs first. I don't remember whether I had read her at that stage. I might have, I might not have. I'm not really quite sure.
Okay, keep going. I didn't mean to break your flow.
Yeah, I don't remember whether. But anyway, I had to take. So I started taking night courses at George Washington University, and the first courses I took were. It turned out there's this economist. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Sara Levitan, who was he for many years ran the Center for Manpower Studies. This shows you how far back it goes. It was called the Center for Manpower Studies at George Washington University. As it turned out, at some point he had actually worked for the Upjohn Institute back when it had a Washington office, but that was before then. And then he had left there and he had formed this center, and he taught a course on federal social welfare program, job training and social welfare programs that he taught at the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill. Not at GW. You didn't have to go over to GW from Capitol Hill, which is where I lived in Capitol Hill.
Why? Because he's trying to target people like you?
Oh, yeah. He wanted to meet legislative assistants. He knew that Congress is run by people in their 20s. So he wanted to meet legislative assistants and form linkages with them. So I was one of his students, and Sar was this older gentleman, had from Eastern Europe, Jewish refugee, come to the U.S., had a thick accent, was a real character and a wonderful man and a wonderful teacher. And he had all these grants from the Department of Labor, and he'd come out with a book he had a knack for anticipating what issues would come before Congress, and he had a knack for writing a book on them the year or two before the issue came up. And so
He's
he was
not a faculty member, though. He's not a faculty.
He was a faculty member. He was
at GW.
At GW, but he of course was, I don't know how much, he taught these courses over on Capitol Hill, and he, as I said, he's very well known in the Labor Department. He got tons of grants in the U.S. Labor Department. He got grants from the Ford Foundation and all the different big foundations, because he was doing all these studies of how do we improve job training programs, how do we how do we improve social welfare programs? He was a very applied, policy-oriented economist, and as I said, a wonderful teacher. And I think one of the things that he did was show me that maybe economics wasn't necessarily, I mean, he was very applied, policy-oriented. He was interested in a lot of the same issues I was, how to get people into jobs. And I started seeing that this was maybe something that would fit more in my interest than I thought it was.
Yeah. Wait, so what's his specialization at GW? What is his, like, what would be
Well,
his...
he taught like labor economics courses. He taught applied upper level undergraduate courses. I don't know if he taught graduate courses there. I don't really know. But
you're taking these classes not necessarily with the goal of getting a PhD. You're like, I need to know economics.
I need to know economics, and I still wasn't thinking about it. And but then here I am. I'm in DC. I'm working, and I ended up starting to make some decisions. And I said, okay, I could follow different courses from here on out. One course I could have followed was the political route. I could have stayed in DC. I could have at some point moved on to committee staff, which tend to be older people. The actual committee staff as opposed to the personal administrative assistants. I could have gone to work for some lobby group or interest group as a lobbyist. But I increasingly became interested, feeling like I really wanted to know the solutions to these problems. I didn't want to just debate solutions that other people were coming up with. I wanted to figure out what was true about what made city economies tick and what would help get people into jobs. I didn't want to just, if you're definitely, if you're in politics, you're not figuring out new ideas. You're trying to figure out what ideas you can take from academics or think tanks or whatnot and adapt. And I wanted to come up with the ideas. And so I started talking to Sar Levitan about it. He advised me, and I had taken another course at Joe. I took economet, and then at some point I decided, well, look, maybe I really want to get a graduate degree in economics. So then I started taking the econometrics courses at GW and the math for economists course and intermediate macro and micro. I took those, and so I didn't have enough for a major, but I had enough that and I'd always been good at math, so I did pretty well in the courses. So at that point, I'd taken 5 or 6 economics courses, and I started talking to Sar Levitan. I still was kind of debating, should I do a joint PhD law degree? But I remember
did they do those back then? Was that the thing?
They did. I think Berkeley had one back then.
Oh, okay.
And I was thinking about that, and Levitan just said to me, look, Bartik, make up your mind. Do you want to be a lawyer or you want to be an economist? If you want to be a lawyer, go to law school. If you want to be an economist, go get a PhD. Don't start doing this Mickey Mouse where you're
making your own major. You were wanting to make
you're trying to do both.
PhD.
Because his view was, well, that was, I was just avoiding making a decision. So I decided eventually that I really wanted to do the economics route. And then I really wanted to do it because I really wanted to know more. I felt like I didn't know enough to really know this, figure out the solutions to these problems. And so I would go off in economics.
Yeah. So this is like 78 then.
Yeah, 78 was when what's the timing? I started grad school in the fall of 78, and so I was applying whatever I guess late 77 I'd be applying to jobs and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, so what's did he give you advice, like say the kind of school you'd be really good at is this like labor public place, or does he like, you just need to get in the best school you can get in?
He just said go to whatever school you want to go to. Just go to a good school. And I kind of looked at the rankings of the schools and whatnot. But I actually, I very much at that stage, I think I was already aware that grad school can be, a tough environment personally.
Yeah.
And so I actually remember I got into a number of and in fact, I'm sure my choices by today's standards be judged as idiosyncratic. I mean, I got an NSF fellowship.
Mm,
I got into MIT. I got into Columbia. I got into Stanford. And I ended up going to Wisconsin, which,
mm,
most people would say, gee, you should go to the top ranked school. And even at the time, I think Wisconsin was, I don't know what it was considered then, seventh ranked or eighth ranked or something. But
mm,
I actually visited most of these schools. And this, I actually went on a trip. I went to visit MIT. I went on a trip. I visited Wisconsin, Northwestern, Michigan. I had all gotten into all those places. And I talked
mm.
to a bunch of students at Stanford. And Wisconsin was the place that they're seeing at that time, and I think things are different today. I mean, from what I hear from people, Wisconsin had a lot of people who were kind of like me. They
Mm,
had students who had spent a few years after undergraduate and had worked, say, for the AFL-CIO, or they'd worked in some other. I mean, now a lot of people do these pre-docs where they're research
yeah.
assistants but that wasn't so much that. There were people who had worked in some politically active field in
Mm,
DC or elsewhere. And the other schools weren't like that. More of the students seemed to be just out of undergrad. And I felt much more in common with the students at Wisconsin. They
yeah.
also had the Poverty Institute there then, the Institute for Research on Poverty, which is still there, but then was the only one, I think, and had more
Mm,
funding. And that was attractive to me. And I'm trying to think what else. I just felt that, look, I need to be in an environment where, I have something in common with the fellow students, that I'm going in
yeah.
economics and I'm really interested in public policy.
Mm,
I'm not that I liked the math and economics. I was good at it. I was fine at econometrics, but I was interested in economics as a way to affect public policy. And I was specifically very interested in how to help cities and how to help
yeah.
distressed places like cities, even
Cities come
then.
about when you write that big piece. That's the first time that
Well,
cities got in your
I've been
mind.
interested in it from being back in high school, and as I said,
Mm,
seeing Germantown and seeing some of the racial tensions, and also just
yeah.
reading the newspapers. I mean, look, it was pretty much the civil rights movement and everything that happened there. There were tons of studies back then, talking about the nation states. I remember reading. I do know one. I don't remember whether I read Jane Jacobs, but I definitely, when I was working in D.C., I was reading William Julius Wilson's
Yeah.
books. The sociologist at Harvard, the truly
Truly
disadvantaged,
disadvantaged.
the
Yep.
urban underclass, and some of the other books,
Hmm.
which are great books on
Yeah.
the importance of jobs to what happens in a neighborhood, which is,
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's coming back. I mean, essentially the recent thing that the Chetty group at Harvard has come up with, looking at the importance of getting people into jobs for what happens to a community.
Yeah.
But that was what I was interested in.
Hmm.
And so I went to Wisconsin because I thought, well, here are a bunch of the other grad students and I will have more in common, and that's going to be a good environment for me to do my
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. 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 So you get there, you're good in math. So was that first year brutal mathematically, or was it
No,
not
it
that
was
bad?
fine. I mean, I actually took it. I did decide I'd do the math for economists at Wisconsin. So they had an option. You either go right into a micro the first year, or you could do like a math prep course in the fall. And I did the
Oh, I
math
see.
prep course in the fall, but I did fine at that. And you know, you know, I'll always be grateful to Wisconsin. I mean, I got a superb instruction in econometrics at Wisconsin. I mean, first year I took Art Goldberger
Yeah.
as first year grad econometrics. Second year I took Gary Chamberlain, who was then at Wisconsin,
Oh my
second year
gosh. Well, yeah,
econometrics.
I always forget when these guys are there. So those two teach you econometrics. Keep going. Sorry.
Oh yeah, and they were superb. I mean, the thing about both Goldberger and Chamberlain is they weren't they here they are both well-known econometricians.
Yeah.
uh, and different, generations of econometricians, but both extremely dedicated to their teaching and both very good teachers.
Mm,
And they really were thoughtful. They would listen to questions and think about them.
mm.
And, there were no stupid questions in those course. People would ask a question and, Art Goldberger would really think about it. He would really
Yeah.
think about it a while. And then he would say, okay, I think what you're getting at is this, and one of the reasons why I'm very grateful to them is that I kind of felt for the 20 years after that I was ahead of the game.
Mm,
I'm not a technical econometrician. I've never been a technical econometrician, but I have pretty good intuitive econometrics, and that really comes about from how Goldberger and Chamberlain taught those courses. I mean, yes, you did the matrices and this and that and everything, but you also tried to get more of an intuition as to what was going on when you're estimating an equation, and what does instrumental variables really mean? What does what's going on? What are you trying to do?
yeah.
And what can you actually tell from data and what can't you tell?
Right.
And I felt I got a very good grounding in the fundamentals of econometric intuition from them. And
Yeah.
that was extremely helpful to me. Now I don't feel like I'm ahead, but I kind of feel like econometrics has caught up. A lot of the stuff you see coming in the last 20 years, it seems to me, was stuff they were already doing
Mm,
back then.
mm.
And then gradually that approach to econometrics kind of became more prevalent. But I don't think it necessarily was at the time. What they were doing was really something special. And I had other good teachers too. My advisor was Gene Smolensky, who was quite a character and a wonderful person who was very helpful to me later on in my career. And Bob Haveman was another mentor of mine. I interacted a lot with Sheldon Danziger, who was actually
Mm,
taught in the social work school then, but was around. And I designed my own course. I took a course I was interested. I took a reading course with Gene Smolensky in urban and regional economics.
mm.
We designed a whole reading list. I'm sure we read Jane Jacobs then,
Yeah.
as well as many other things. And I took a course on benefit cost analysis with Bob Haveman that was just wonderful. I remember him introducing social discount rates and saying, he said, well, here are the papers I know we need to read. And I'm not sure I completely understand these papers, but we'll figure them out together. And
Ah,
so, I mean, what a great liberating thing to say to a class that, this
yeah.
stuff is hard, it's complicated. Some of the issues with, say, social discount rate are really philosophical in nature almost. What are you trying to
Yeah.
do?
Yeah.
And so we would read the different things, and those were great. So there were some wonderful teachers at Wisconsin. And then I don't know if you looked at my resume, I also spent a year at the University of Chicago while I was at Wisconsin.
Oh, I didn't see that. Oh, I missed that. You were at Chicago. So what drew you to Chicago?
Well, I met my now wife, who'd been married to since 1981, but I met her. She was in her second year. Deb was in her second year of social work school, and I was in my first year of econ. And then she moved to Chicago to get a job, and so we
Mm,
commuted back and forth for a year. And then it
mm,
was time to decide, is this gonna be serious or not? And so I was finished all my coursework at the end of 2 years. I had passed all the prelim exams and everything.
yeah.
I was ready. I didn't have any course I had to take.
Right.
And there's this weird program that I think still exists that dates back to when you were in Chicago as part of the Big Ten, that
Hmm.
any student at a Big Ten graduate program can pay tuition to their home institution and visit another graduate institution in the Big Ten or the University of Chicago if you can
Mm,
find a sponsor. So I got George Tolley in the econ department of the University of Chicago to be my sponsor. And I
oh,
went down to the University of Chicago for a year, and George got me an office. He brought in lots of grants to the econ department at Chicago, and I sat in on a few courses at Chicago, and basically I tried to come up with a dissertation topic. That was what I
oh,
did. Well,
huh.
and then So that was
Who's
interesting.
there?
Just
So what labor economists would you have been? Is it labor and public kind of that you're like
well, I don't remember interacting with the
gravitating
labor
towards?
people. I sat in on well, I sat in obviously Tolly taught a course on urban economics. I sat in on
Yeah.
that. I sat in on Harburger was taught a public finance course, and I sat in on that, and I remember that. I had already kind of taken the econometrics, so I sat in occasionally on Jim Heckman's econometrics course, but not that much because um, well, basically, I felt like I'd already gotten that material
Yeah.
uh, from Goldberger and Chamberlain,
Yeah.
but I'd interact some with, when I experienced the Chicago style. I remember when I was working on my starting my dissertation research, I presented some preliminary paper at Chicago. And this is back before, PowerPoints, you had like overheads.
Yeah.
And I show the title, and I start out with the overhead on with my title. And before I started, someone said, I can already tell from your title that your talk's going to be BS. That's not exactly what they said, and I said, well, if you wait and listen for a while, you can be sure. So, but that's Chicago at that time, very abrupt, very, very different environment from Wisconsin. And so that was interesting. It was a very different environment. But I was basically going there largely because, and I ended up working out.
You're falling in love.
I was in love. I wanted to be with my,
yeah, exactly.
We ended up getting engaged. We got married. I came back to Madison for my fourth year.
So that's how you became a radical libertarian, was that 1 year in Chicago?
Well, it was interesting. I love talking to people in Chicago. I mean, of course, people in Chicago have diverse,
no, I'm just joking.
views.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Aaron Dubé went to Chicago. I mean,
Yeah,
so,
no, I'm just joking. I'm just joking.
Yeah.
Okay. So you end up graduating. What do you write your dissertation on? So I guess before our conversation, I kind of was like, yeah, Tim's going to have this strong labor background, but now I'm realizing I knew it was urban, but it's more urban than I was thinking. It's less labor.
Well, my major fields at Wisconsin were labor and public finance. Actually, I only had to take a prelim in labor. I mean, but I'd also taken all the public finance courses. My dissertation was on the benefits and costs of neighborhood change.
Yeah.
And it was partly because HUD had this dissertation grant program where I could use data from the experimental housing allowance program and look at neighborhood change. And I was interested in that from my work with the Senate Bank Committee, because even back then there was a lot of debate about gentrification. So gentrification is not a new issue. People think that it's developed. No, it was a big issue back in the 70s. People were debating it. And, the question is, how do you measure the benefits and costs of neighborhood change? So I got into doing stuff with the Hedonic price models and this and that. And how do you measure benefits? And how do you infer willingness to pay from housing price variations?
Yeah.
Crime rates and school quality.
Oh, that's what your hedonic stuff is coming from? It's coming from that?
Yeah, it came out of my dissertation.
Oh.
Which back then, of course, the 3 essays was not the
so you didn't do the 3 essays. Your
dissertation was like a book. But
yeah.
I did end up getting 2 papers out of it. I got one that was published in JPE and one in Journal.
That's right. Yeah, and an RE Stat. Those come in 85.
Yeah, and Restat. I got 3 different papers that came out of that dissertation. And actually, I ended up getting hired as a public finance economist. I taught when I ended up, as you know, for the thing, I went to Vanderbilt, and they didn't hire me to teach labor. They already had a number of labor economists, Rich Burkhauser, Kathy Anderson, and others. They hired me to teach public finance.
Okay.
And that's what I taught. I taught both undergraduate and graduate public finance.
Oh, I didn't realize Burkhauser, for some reason, I thought he's at Cornell, I thought, right?
Well, yes, I don't know if he retired at this stage, but he ended up going to Cornell at some point.
Oh, so he started out, he was at Vanderbilt.
He was at Vanderbilt when I was there, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I'm piecing this together. So you're teaching public finance. Is that changing your research agenda, or like, were you always really open to whatever?
No, I don't know if it really changed my research agenda. I mean, I'd always been interested in these issues. Like I said, I was interested in political philosophy and things like that. So to me, benefit cost analysis definitely fits into, it's one way of looking at what the public should do, what the government should do. So to me, it was very consistent with what else I did. And I also, while I was at Vanderbilt, I was able to get started on I had actually wanted to do my dissertation on something to do with urban jobs and job creation, but I couldn't get access to the data I wanted, which was at that time Roger Schmenner's data on the business location decisions of the Fortune 500 companies. I didn't have the money.
Oh,
But when I was at Vanderbilt, I got a grant and I bought his data and I wrote a paper on what determined business location decisions
yeah.
in terms of taxes and
Is that one of your
unionization.
earliest papers?
That's one of the earliest papers, and I was very helped by that. Dennis Carlton. Okay, so this is something that should happen more. That was a paper I submitted. The
Yeah.
referee report from Dennis Carlton. They told me who it was. I don't know. They're supposed to, but they did.
Yeah.
And Dennis Carlton said, "This is a good paper. You should publish it as is."
Oh,
Now, that doesn't happen very much, but it really was very helpful to me in my career, getting a paper published, without having to go through, 3 million revise and resubmits.
yeah.
And I feel sorry for a lot of the assistant professors now trying to get tenure because the scholarly norms have shifted in a way that I think is not great. We're shifting towards endless revise and resubmits when
Yeah.
people need to be getting on with their research. Not that
Yeah.
they're, I mean, there's a happy medium.
Right.
And and then I started getting into Erwin Hargrove, who was head of the Vanderbilt Institute of Public Policy Studies, got me involved in a project to study Tennessee's economic development programs. And I spent a whole summer running around the state, interviewing local economic development, interviewing business leaders, and
Oh, that must have been fun.
it was great. And I learned a lot about how economic development programs run.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the key. You need to have an institutional knowledge of policy to
Yep.
really contribute. So I started getting into economic development policy. And actually, that project indirectly led later on to the so-called Bartik instrument, which I didn't
Yeah.
name, but I'm happy to take it. But
Yep.
some of the stuff I came up with in that project, for that project, I did a lot of shift share analysis of Tennessee's economy as part of in addition to doing only interviews with people.
Well, wait, why does that come up? You're talking to these, why would shift share come up from these conversations?
Well, because it's one way of analyzing an economy. When you ask what's going on in Tennessee's economy or any state's economy or any local economy, one thing you want to ask is, okay, so let's say a state is growing fast. Is that because it has a good mix of industries?
Yeah.
Or is it because the same industry is growing faster in that state than it is nationwide? Furthermore, you want to decompose what's going on in growth and what industries are the ones whose differential growth is driving the overall growth. So shift share analysis is still, I mean, people can make fun of it, say, okay, it's basically a good way, if used artfully, is a very good way to analyze a local economy. I've used it, I used it just a few years ago in a project we were doing. If you use it right, it's a very good way of analyzing an economy. And so I gained a lot of knowledge of shift share analysis, and that became useful later on when I started getting into this whole issue of how do you identify labor demand shocks in local labor markets.
Yeah, right. So you just are, okay, in this book, you're saying in this book that you write, 91, you write obvious candidates for instruments or variables shifting metropolitan area labor demand, MSA labor demand. So you were already, the question was, you were wanting to know the effect of employment on economic growth. And I guess what were people doing in your community before that wanted to know the answer to that question? Because I guess
I'm not sure people
dissatisfying, right?
Well, let me explain where that thing came out of. It came out of, okay, example of research coming out of teaching. I was teaching an upper division urban and regional economics course at Vanderbilt. And and I was teaching some of the usual stuff that was part of urban economics, the Muth Mills monocentric city model and this and that and everything. But to me, what was missing from that was the whole regional standpoint. And this whole issue I mentioned before. I mean, William Julius Wilson, you're concerned about who gets jobs and what jobs do. And so one of the fundamental, and I started looking around and saying, well, where's the research literature on how either labor demand shocks or labor supply shocks affect the employment rate, the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, or the real wage rates, et cetera. And, and then at the time, there were some economists who said, well, basically, local job creation, it's all just capitalized in the land values. So trying to improve your local labor market through attracting jobs is pointless. All it's going to do is drive up land values. Real wages will be the same. Unemployment will be the same. If it varies, it's just going to be a compensating differential or something. Maybe you'll have high real wages and high unemployment, or low real wages and low, or maybe it compensates for amenities or whatnot.
Yeah.
But the basic attitude was that job creation, local job creation, was doomed to simply, and there wasn't much literature on this, really. There were not a huge literature on what are the effects of labor demand and labor supply shocks. And I started trying to think about, well, what, how could you, because there is this problem, what's, if, an area can have fast employment growth because of a labor demand shock, which will push unemployment down and push real wages up, or it could be due to a labor supply shock, do the reverse.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, at least in theory, you'd think it would do the reverse.
Yeah.
And how can you distinguish between the two? And then I went back and thought, well, the shift share stuff can be applied. And I realized from my previous study that, the key contribution I made to this area was not, well, first of all, I didn't invent shift share analysis. Some people raise, but I didn't invent that. It goes back years. And I wasn't even the first person who had used this as a demand indicator. What I was is someone who, in the appendix to the book, one of the appendices, I went through explaining why this instrument proxied for shocks to the export base. That was my contribution, explaining
Just
that
this
essentially
clear explanation
that why does this work? Because intuitively it doesn't make sense, because you use all the industries in creating the instrument. So why is it a proxy for shocks to the export base? Well, it has to do with the fact that export-based industries have employment shares that vary more across local areas than non-export based. So
yeah,
that's the reason.
But you're not the first to use it as an instrument. I actually can't remember.
No one used it as an instrument, but people had used this.
They had used it. Like
there was at least one
Richard
paper
Freeman
that said
stuff.
this is demand. There's a demand indicator, but they didn't. I don't think they used it as an instrument. They just said, well, let's look at whether this is correlated with wage rates, and they found some correlation. So, and I didn't know about that when I initially developed my thing. I found that later on when I was writing out the book. I said, oh wait. I wanted to say no one else had previously used it, and I started searching around to make sure that was the case. I said, well, no, that's not. I'm really not the case. These previous people had used it. My contribution was to show why it was a good instrument, or at least potentially good instrument. And that's partly. One of the things I would say about that is that's an example of one thing I think that does contribute to research productivity is taking an idea from one area of economics and applying it to another. In this case, I'm taking an idea from kind of applied regional economics and applying it to an issue of local labor markets, which is a different field, a slightly different field.
Yeah, yeah. Do you get a sense that it's influential as it's becoming influential? Because don't Katz and Blanchard end up using it too?
Right. Well, but I don't know how they came across my work exactly. That's an interesting question. But at some point, I was contacted. I don't remember whether it was by Blanchard or Katz, actually. But one of them contacted me and said, we're doing this Brookings papers thing. And we'd heard about this instrumental variable that you've developed. And we wanted to know whether or not you would have data. I actually sent them some data they used in the, I sent them some, it turned out we were using similar years or something. I don't remember. But
Yeah.
I sent them some data with the instrument already calculated. And I sent them, I think, copies of the papers I had, because this was developed, I don't remember the exact timing. The original version, I actually, before I left Vanderbilt, I had a grant from the Upjohn Institute to develop the book, to write the book. So I got the grant like in 1988 or something. And I came to the Institute.
Is this your first book? Was this your first? Because you've written a bunch, right? This becomes a big part of your life, is writing books. Am I wrong?
I've written a bunch of books. I like the idea of writing books. I know it's not fashionable in economics, but I personally think that if you can think about your career as more than individual papers, but even if you're not going to do books, if you at least can think about it as, okay, these 4 or 5 papers could be a book.
Yeah.
They fit together and they tell an overall story.
Yeah.
That's a better way of approaching a career than just saying, I'm a economist. I do whatever project happens to come along with the right data. I don't think I think the best approach is get into a policy field, learn the institutions, talk to people in the field, find out what's going on, find out what issues are relevant, find out where the data is. And you find out all kinds of stuff that otherwise you're going to be very uninformed. You'll be blundering into all kinds of things.
Well, it's not just that. It's like you learn all that stuff and then you can't even put it in the articles.
Right.
Whereas you can put it in the books.
Right.
So
really so one of the things I was attracted to when I came to the Institute was the fact that at that time, the idea was you were supposed to, and the Institute has always defined research productivity more broadly than doing academic articles, but they want you to write other things. And at the time we were saying we wanted people at the Institute staff to write books. I thought that was great. And so I've written now, I think, 5 books. And of course the Institute likes it if you do policy briefs and issue briefs and op-eds and testify before committees and that kind of thing.
So you leave Vanderbilt, you don't stay in academia. Why not just stay in academia? What's the draw?
You may or may not know. I mean, I was denied tenure at Vanderbilt.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, with that JPE and that RE stat and all, you had a bunch of stuff.
I'm sure I don't completely know the complete story, but the department wrote in my favor.
Oh,
but I had some negative votes. I think it might be partly some of the negative votes. The department at that time had a very big split between the applied people and the theory people.
Right.
I was obviously in the applied.
You're casualty of this thing.
And then the dean overturned the decision. And actually, I remember the dean and the department appealed, and the dean denied the appeal. And so the dean, who was actually a Southern historian, I remember the letter they wrote denying me tenure. He said, well, Bartik's work on hedonics seems like it's good, but his work on state and local economic development policies does not appear to be of lasting importance. So that was kind of ironic given things happened subsequently. But, so that was was
that a big blow?
Well, sure. I mean, look, anyone who's been denied tenure will tell you that's not a good thing. Psychologically, because all of us as researchers have some, you're doing this stuff, you're trying to do important work, and I had been told by the department there'd be no problems in getting tenure. But obviously the department, powers that be, didn't reckon with the internal politics of Vanderbilt, which Vanderbilt was also at that time trying to get tougher in tenure standards. They wanted to up their reputation. They wanted to move up relative to Duke, et cetera. And so that may have played part of it too, as to why the dean overturned it. I think he felt he needed to overturn some departmental decisions where there was dissension. It was definitely a blow. I mean, psychologically. I'm still grateful for Gene Smolensky because I called him. I immediately called up different mentors of mine, and I remember I called up Gene, and I'll censor this slightly. His immediate response was, "Forget them.
Yeah,
They're idiots. You'll be better off."
Yeah.
And in fact, I think in the end, I think I would have been fine if I had stayed at Vanderbilt. I was very involved in different things in Tennessee. I was on the governor's task force on housing. I was in the governor's advisory committee on economic development.
Mm.
Uh, a good friend of mine, Bill Purcell, was in this state house, and he later on became the mayor of Nashville. So I'm sure if I had stayed in Nashville, I would have. And he was also House at one point when the Democrats still had a majority in the state house. He was majority leader of the state house. I'm sure he would have been involved in Tennessee policy and Nashville policy. But the Upjohn Institute has been a great place to do research because, as I said, it operates like a research university with no students. And you're pretty much free to do research as long as it has something to do with improving U.S. labor markets. And we have an endowment that supports, they're like if you bring in grants, but that's true of research universities too. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're realistic about it.
Hmm.
And it's been a great place to work because they like doing applied policy work. They appreciate writing policy briefs and testifying before
Mm.
committees. And they also appreciate publishing articles in academic journals. You need to do both, but
Mm.
they have a broader, whereas at Vanderbilt, I remember when I was doing some of this stuff, people would say, well, why are you wasting time being on the governor's task force on housing?
Right.
Why aren't you publishing more articles or something? And my viewpoint is, look, if I went into economics to affect public policy,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and if you're telling me I need to give that up in order to succeed in economics,
So it
it's not
defeats the
worth the
purpose.
game. Not
Right.
worth it. To
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
you have to be engaged, and the way to be engaged is for example, being on the governor's task force on economic development. I got to interact with top staff to the governor and with other people in the state and learn about what their concerns were about economic development and learn, to me, this kind of institutional knowledge is absolutely key.
Yep.
And if I personally would always advise someone figure out an area you love that you're enthused about, that you're willing to do
Yep.
research till the cows come home.
Yep.
But then talk to policymakers, talk to policy influencers, talk to the news media, talk to
Mhm.
people and learn about it. I mean, I've talked to a lot of local economic developers, a lot of job trainers, a lot of government officials in my career. And I think it's that kind of interaction with city officials and whatnot is to me absolutely key to having a successful policy-oriented career in economics.
Totally. Totally. I completely agree. So why didn't you stay in academia though? So you leave, is it just that you're like Upjohn really was the better fit and you could tell it was the better fit or what?
I think it was the best offer I had at the time. I mean, there were some other things I could have done, but for a variety of reasons, I thought this was the best fit. I mean,
Mm.
I didn't know whether it'd be the best fit. My view was, look, they basically have told me I can complete my book, right?
Right.
I was working on my book, hiring 89, the book came out in 91. So I was working mostly on that the first year or two.
Yeah.
And then I got involved with various regional economics projects and some other things in economic development and local labor markets. And there were several other papers I did then. I think my thinking at the time was, this is a good job now. We'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't like it,
Mm.
or if my wife hates, if we decide we hate Kalamazoo or, whatever, then I'll publish a bunch of stuff over the next 4 or 5 years and
Mm.
then go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, I've stayed. I've kind of showed my own argument that people have high moving cost applies to me. I mean, Kalamazoo is fine as a community. I mean, my wife's from Minneapolis. Maybe if the Hubert Humphrey School had ever offered me a job, I would have gone there. But who
Mm-hmm.
knows?
Mm-hmm.
As it
Mm-hmm.
was, I occasionally got nibbles from places that were interested in recruiting me, but there was never anything that seemed to me to outweigh the advantages of the Institute as a place where pretty much I could, and I've been very supported by the different, directors, the presidents of the Institute I've had, Bob Spiegelman and Randy Eberts and Mike Horrigan, all of whom have been very supportive of my research and have let me kind of do my own thing, which I do with the other researchers here too. The Institute, I said, is very unique. It's not like, contrary to what people think, it is not like a consulting firm. It's not even like Brookings. I mean, most of the funds for the research of the Institute are from our endowment. So we don't have to get grants or contracts for everything we do. I would not have. I remember actually when they were trying to recruit me, Steve Woodward at the Institute called me up and said, "You should apply for this job. We want to hire a regional economist at the Institute." And I said, "Well, Steve, I don't want to work for a consulting firm." I mean, I have all great respect for people working for consulting firms, but I wanted to pick my own research topics.
Yeah.
And he said, "You don't understand. It's not like that." And it's not. It because of the endowment supports what 80% of our budget or research budget, 85%. Essentially, it's no more constrained by grants than an average research university is. I mean, as you know, at a research university, you're in a lot better shape with the department chair and the dean if you're bringing in grants occasionally, and it's
yeah.
people like it.
Yeah, sure. I'm just curious. When did you start to really when did it start to become really salient that book and that instrument was being associated with you and becoming, like it's being called the Bartik instrument and you're watching it get used more and more? Was that at Upjohn? It had to have been, it had to have been, right? Because Upjohn's 91, you're writing the book in 91.
Right. I don't remember exactly when. I just remember it seems to have increased over time. Maybe it's peaked a couple of years ago. I don't know. But it definitely was something that picked up after 2000 and the 2010s. It definitely picked up throughout the early 2000s, throughout the 2010s.
Yeah.
I don't remember when I first heard the term Bartik instrument.
Yeah. That must have been weird.
It kind of weird. I mean, I guess, look, I mean, I'm very fortunate. I'm fortunate that Blanchard and Katz in their Brookings papers gave me full credit for it. I mean, which, some people might not have done if they had people with less ethics. And they gave me full credit for it. So people knew that this idea, it wasn't called the Blanchard Katz instrument. And I don't know who. I should probably pay royalties or something to whoever started calling it the Bartik instrument. I have no idea who it is. If anyone knows, please let me know, because I have no idea. I mean, someone once told me they thought it came out of Ed Leeser's class at Harvard. I don't know if that's the case.
We should get on Google Scholar. I'll get on Google Scholar, see if I can find it. It would be Bartik instrument and quotates. I can find it. I'll find it.
I don't know what I mean. That's a sociology of who actually came up with the term. I mean, I assume it was someone teaching a course something who said, well, this is an instrument. You can call it the Bartik. We'll call it the Bartik instrument. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm lucky. My last name is 2 syllables.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like you only call stuff after it's like its form is known. So it's not like it's used so much that people are like, it's constructed this way. It means this. And this is when you use, and so probably the naming, I can imagine that the naming comes.
I assume someone teaching a course originated it.
Yeah.
I have no idea who it was. Like I said, I mean, obviously, I don't have a big enough ego that I would have named it that myself. On the other hand, I'm certainly not going to turn it down. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have someone name an instrument for you, as long as you're not saying as the completely stupid Bartik instrument, as long as they don't think it's a really dumb idea. I mean, people have critiqued it, but I don't think people are saying it's a dumb idea. They're just saying there are some limitations of it. I mean, but there are no perfect instruments. That's the reality.
I mean, Peter Hull. I have this platform called Mixtape Sessions, and Peter Hull teaches a whole class on shift share instruments. I mean, it's like
Right. And
he's
I
devoted a
occasionally,
lot of time to it.
I occasionally have thought about going back. I'm 70. I'm not sure I'm going to do it, but I do think there are things that could be said about the debate over the validity of the instrument. I'm not really going to go into that here, but uh, yeah, to me, obviously that's something that has been an influence in economics. My view, though, if I think about influences I've tried to have, a lot of my influence, I think, what I've tried to promote is the notion that yes, there are ways you can create jobs and increase employment rates. Actually,
Yeah.
to me, the more important part of the 91 book, the Bartik instrument was one thing, but actually in
Right.
part of the book, I showed you didn't even need the instrument. That
Oh.
basically year to year fluctuations in job growth are mostly demand driven anyway. And so the
Mhm.
instrumental variable estimates were not statistically significantly different from the OLS
Mhm.
estimates.
Yeah,
But
sure.
and so people forget that part of the book I said, well, you don't if your data is at annual frequency, you may not need the Bartik instrument.
Mm.
And so that was important to show, though, that short run job fluctuation demand driven. But the other thing that the book showed, which I think has held up in subsequent research, is that local job shocks, once and for all job shocks, have very profound long run implications. They're
Yeah.
not capitalized into land values, or not totally.
Mhm.
They do
Right.
persistently increase employment rates. And, other work I think has backed this up. Some of Andy Guerin's work, other folks, Matthew Friedman's work, other people's work has backed up the notion that, well, two notions. One, that local job growth can have profound long run effects on employment rates due to short run job experience leading to long run economic success,
Yeah.
dynamic effects of job shocks. And, second, I think the other thing you see coming out, especially with some of Chase Lee's work, there are huge social benefits of increased employment rates. So to me, the original reason I went into economics, which was I was convinced that we needed to get more people in distressed places into jobs,
Yeah.
is really, if you actually look at my work, most of my work over the years, in one way or another, is focused on how do you get more people into good jobs, including what I do now at the Institute. I co-direct our Policies for Place initiative with my
Mhm.
co-directors, Brad Hirschbein and Michelle Miller-Adams. And we're very much focused on what labor demand and labor supply policies will best get people in distressed places into good jobs. And so to
Mhm.
me, I've been pursuing in many, many different ways the same central policy issue, which is
Yeah.
how do you make sure that in many ways the national economy right now is doing pretty well. A lot of American workers are doing pretty well, but there are still people in certain local labor markets, rural Appalachia, the rural South, but also places like Fresno have very low employment rates in those local labor markets. And of course, within otherwise booming areas, there are these neighborhoods where the employment rate's very low. And I think
Yeah.
that's a huge social problem. We need to think about how do we solve that? And my point of my work over the years is you cannot solve this problem exclusively through mobility incentives for people.
Mm.
Yes, it's fine to help increase mobility so people can move to jobs, but you also need to move jobs to people. That
Right.
both
Right.
sides, you need to work on both.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Well, I have one last question because I've kept you for a long time. This is kind of an odd question, so like put on your science fiction hat a little bit. I want you to imagine that your old self who was denied tenure had a time machine and he could come to you right now. And I'm curious, what do you think he would have been at that kind of crossroads in his life as he's processing everything? What do you think he would have wanted to ask you? And then what would you want to say to him right now?
Well, I guess what would he want to ask me? I mean, I guess he'd want to ask me if things worked out. Was I able to recover from what, I mean, it's not the worst thing that's ever had in my life. I mean, I would say again, my parents getting divorced was, more
Mhm.
personally traumatic, frankly, than getting denied tenure. But, it's definitely not, getting fired from a job essentially is not, who likes getting fired from a job? I guess
Yeah.
you're right. Did it work out? Were you able to do what you wanted to do? Or was this something that, put your career into a spiral you didn't recover from?
Mm.
And so that's what I guess. And what I'd want to tell them is that, yeah, I think things did work out. I mean, and it worked out. I think I made a good choice of a job. I mean, I think I would have been fine if I had stayed at Vanderbilt, and maybe I would have moved somewhere else eventually. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think things worked out fine. I've been able to do the research I like to do. I think, as I said, I think it's obviously, I think people in economics know more about the Bartik instrument, but I think people who work on state and local economic development policy, people in urban planning schools and places like that, I think they know more about my work on writing about how to improve state and local economic development policies,
Mm.
and people in the government know about this. People in economic developers and other
Mm.
folks, and I think I have been able to make a contribution to the debate, and I have been able to. But of course, part of this is luck. I mean, the Institute happened to have an opening that year. So, one of the things to realize, I mean, yes, I think I work, I'm always conscious of the fact, you work to do things, but you also depend a little bit on luck.
Yeah, totally.
And obviously the Bartik, something being called the Bartik instrument is luck. It's not due to me.
That's helped your career a lot, huh?
It helped my career. Yeah. And on the other hand, I mean, I think, the fact that the Upjohn Institute ended up having an opening at the right time is luck.
Yeah.
And the fact that different projects came along the way and they were interesting to me. Some of the work I've done on preschool, which came out of nowhere. And you need to have a career plan, but you also need to be able to respond to opportunities that come along. And some of them are, and I've made choices. I probably have made choices that I could have improved upon. But on the whole, I think I've been able to make a contribution to public policy. I do think that more people in the economic development policy space now think about economic development as being about improving labor markets rather than simply making money for the government. I think in the past, you sometimes heard people say, well, the reason we're doing economic development is it makes money for the government. We're giving away these tax incentives because we think we're going to get back more revenue. And I think people now are saying, no, it's more of a labor market policy. It's an active labor market policy of a sort.
Has that always been your long bet?
Well, I didn't, of course, when I started doing the work that led the 91 book, I didn't know. Maybe I would have concluded that everything was capitalized in land values.
Yeah, right.
You have to be willing to look at the data. And in some ways, it would have been easier to write a book that said, who benefits from state and local economic development policies? The answer could have been landowners.
Yep.
Instead, it's a little more complicated. Landowners gain, but so do workers.
Right.
And the question of who gains the most varies. I mean, actually, in some of my recent work has shown, in really booming areas, maybe it is all capitalized in the land values. And essentially, in a really booming area, all the jobs go to immigrants. There are very little effect on employment rates. And so, so it's a little more complicated story, but it would have been easy to write a book that said, this is all a boondoggle, all this stuff. It's all capitalized in land values. If you want to create jobs for people, you need national policy, not these local policies. Local policies are powerless to really do anything given mobility. That would have been another thing, but you had to be willing to go with what the data tell you.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Wow. Well, it's been a really remarkable career. I mean, it's been, you've made a very unique career, this academic, and then moving into to Upjohn and having all of this like econometrically rigorous influence and work, and then carving out this like very powerful research agenda on economic growth and regional. It's very exciting and inspiring. I really appreciate you giving me this like window into it. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I appreciate the chance to talk about some of this stuff. And as I said, I hope I guess one thing when you said the interview, I mean, I did want to mention specifically that I had been denied tenure. I didn't know whether you'd bring it up or you even knew about it, but because I do think that people face setbacks in their career.
Yeah.
And, one thing I do want to say is that, I think people can respond to setbacks, and I'm not saying it's easy, but if you have a clear idea of what body of research you want to do, if you have a career plan, I really would, of course, it's very different depending on what but if for someone who is interested in economics as a policy field, which, some economists aren't, they're more interested, it's just fine. I mean, I'm not putting down someone who just wants to do technical work.
Right.
But if you're interested in policy space, I urge you to figure out some policy area that for whatever reason you just find fascinating. In my case, it was jobs in distressed cities. But in your case, it might be how to get everyone health care, or how to improve
Mine's
child development.
Mine's the mental illness in the jails and prisons, which came up about 6 years ago. It was a big switch.
Well, it's got to be something you have a passion for, that you're willing to slog through a lot
Right.
of really tough data issues. How do you get good data, and how do you clean the data, and how do you deal with all these problems, and the data is messy, and because frankly, research, as you know, it's a long slog. You work on the stuff, and a lot of times you bang your head against the wall, and some projects don't work out. You work on it for a while, and then all of a sudden you decide to cut your losses and go into something else.
Yeah, totally.
And you have to have some passion for some, if you're a policy or kind for some policy area, you think this is so important, you're willing to persevere even despite the setbacks, whether it's being denied tenure or having some data set that doesn't work out, it ends up being screwed up for whatever reason,
Right.
Or you can't get, it turns out you thought you get the data, then you can't, whatever. But so I would just urge people to encourage, persevere, but develop a passion for some policy and learn the institutions, learn the people, learn the political game. Not that you necessarily want to tell them what they want to hear.
Right.
You need to be willing to tell them. I mean, a lot of economic developers, I've been critical of economic development incentives. A lot of they don't necessarily agree with me, but that's fine.
You called it a research plan, or did you call it a career plan?
I think you need to have a career plan that's kind of like you map out, okay, this is what I want to do long term.
Yeah.
Which is general. And then for the next 5 years, here are the steps I want to do for that.
Totally.
And here's how I feel them fitting together. And then, of course, you need to be willing sometimes to say, hey, I worked on this project for 2 years.
Yeah.
The empirical results are screwed up. They're clearly, the data is too imprecise to tell me what I want to know. And of course, you can try to publish something. This is one problem in economics that has imprecise results, but it's pretty hard to do, unfortunately.
Right. Well, this has been fun. This has been inspiring. I really appreciate you giving me this time, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, and let me know when it comes out. So
I will.
Okay.
She hated when I called and it's late. I hope I never keep you waiting. I hope I never keep you waiting.